Thank you for listening to the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast with hosts Clara and Jimmy Hinton. If you're new to the podcast, please subscribe and share so you will never miss an episode. Android users can find us and subscribe on your Play Music app. Apple users can find us and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. You can find us on Stitcher. You can follow us on Spreaker. And you can find the podcasts on jimmyhinton.org or findingahealingplace.com. Please rate our show, subscribe, and share so that we can spread the word. Let's get into the show. Okay, welcome back to this week's podcast here with hosts Jimmy Hinton
and Jimmy's mom, Clara.
Well, welcome back from your trip.
Thank you.
Yeah, she went out west, and I guess that was a work-related.
It was a work training out in Sacramento, California, where I met a lot of very lovely people. I experienced sunshine every day that I was there, and ate some marvelous food, and then traveled back to good old Pennsylvania and
came back
for
to
some
snow.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, we had snow. What day? That was Sunday.
Yeah.
We had snow here. So that was our first snow of the season. And, well, there will be lots more.
There sure will.
Well, today, in today's episode, we wanted to talk about some things that we see coming down the pike. We've talked about some things before, but maybe just some positive things that we see because of the Me Too, Church Too movement. And, this is by no means factual. This is just our opinion and where we see the church going. And the second part of that is going to be things that we think need to happen. So the first is things, kind of some trends and places where we think the church is going to be headed. And then things that maybe the churches need to be doing to keep change moving in a positive direction. So I have 5 things here, 5 of each for each category. And I think the first thing that I think is going to happen, this is just my opinion, but I think that survivors are going to continue to be empowered tremendously. A lot of people ask whether I think the Me Too movement is just a phase and if it's going to fizzle out. I honestly, legitimately don't. I don't see this.
It's a phase either.
I don't see it losing any momentum whatsoever.
I see it as a growing wave because, like you said in your previous sentence there, survivors are becoming empowered now, and that is a wonderful thing. For years and years and years, there's been this fear of speaking out, of not being believed, of not being heard, of not being understood. And now change is happening, and it's an extremely positive change. And I thank God every day for this.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I think, too, if we look to Pennsylvania at what's happening right now, I mean, tomorrow there's a rally in Harrisburg again.
Right.
By the survivors. Organized by survivors from the grand jury report, but it's open to any survivor. But this is in response to the Senate blocking Senate Bill 261, which is the window to justice.
Right. And I think people have been watching and waiting for the response to that.
Well, I think what both the Catholic Church and the Senate leaders wanted. And this is not all senators. I have to say that I was really encouraged that many senators on both the Republican and Democratic side, they were in favor of this window to justice. It would have passed. If it would have gone up for a vote, it would have passed. They had the votes there. And so I'm really encouraged by that.
I am too. Because
I think we have senators who they want to do the right thing for survivors. That's encouraging. We need to really be encouraged by that. It was the leaders, though, who shut it down. They stopped the vote from happening. But instead of survivors walking away and putting their tail between their legs and saying, well, we've been defeated. It just empowered them. And they were like, nope, hey, we're not shutting up. We're going back up to Harrisburg, and we're going to rally, and we're going to call the senators back to Harrisburg to do their job and to put this bill up for a vote.
And I think they're doing it in a wonderful way, Jimmy. You and I had the opportunity to go together to the walk to the Capitol. You went again while I was away, which was
last
wonderful.
Week.
Right,
I was in Harrisburg.
Last week again. Spent more time with, both the senators and the other governorship that's there, as well as the survivors. And what we're seeing is not this angry, violent group of people, but a respectful group who are saying, okay, we are being heard, but now we want to see some action on this. And they're doing it in such a really good way that I know they are being heard. And part of the reason is because of their attitude, the way they are conducting themselves. But every time they are together, the survivors, they're encouraging each other and creating that safe place that they've wanted for years and years and years. They can talk together, they can cry together, they can laugh together. And that's all part of what they want to see happening. And it's wonderful.
Well, and it empowers them to do other things as well. Having support from other people who believe, it empowers them to do tremendous things. And I don't know if you saw this, but Sean Doherty and his friend, I'm really bad with names, so I apologize if Sean's friend is listening to this. I think his name is Brian, but he was Sean's childhood friend who Sean spoke to us about.
Right.
But Sean and his friend, they confronted his abuser, and that was on national news last week.
I watched that.
That's incredible.
A couple of times. Very difficult to even watch, but so empowering for Sean and his friend.
And ultimately what they're saying to the abuser is, you're not holding any power over us anymore. We know what you did.
I think it's wonderful that they were able to
show your face.
Right.
Look us in the eye. We know what you did to us.
That was
and you may not be
powerful.
In prison, but you're not getting away with it.
Right.
The world's going to know what you did. I love
interview, I encourage everyone to look up on, it's all over Facebook yet. Look that up and watch it. It is powerful. Truly, truly powerful. And again, it was done with a right attitude. Kudos to Sean and his friend.
And I think the second thing that we're going to see continue to happen is that churches are going to be forced by survivors to confront cover-ups in the church. So I'm seeing this a lot. I'm seeing this firsthand because I get an incredible volume of emails from people who they'll write me. I would say 90+% of the emails that I get are from survivors, and they find out that there are abusers in the church, and the church is covering up these abusers. They're covering for the abusers, and so they're writing me and saying, I don't know what to do. I went to my leadership. I talked to them about it. They just shut me down. I see that scenario played over and over. My advice to them always is find other survivors in the congregation and rally around them. And there's strength in numbers.
Right. And
that they're confronting the church leadership, but they're doing it in a positive way. And in a few cases, it's rare right now, but I think it's going to become more frequent. But in rare cases right now, the church leadership, even when they're getting frustrated, they're starting to listen. That's a change that it's really recent.
It's an enormous change.
And it's a very positive change.
It's a wake up. It's a wake up because I don't think that leadership fully realized as a whole what they were doing by not exposing the predators. Now,
and they think too that it's unfair. That I speak to a lot of church leaders, and in I don't want to say in fairness to them, because I still have a hard time wrapping my mind around why you wouldn't inform your congregation when you have known predators in the church.
Right.
But, from their line of reasoning, they think it's unfair because, again, it's rooted in bad theology. They're saying that no sin is worse than another. And so if we quote unquote call these people out for their sin, which that's not what I'm asking them. That's not even what I'm asking them to do.
Not at all.
I'm not asking them to call out these people's sin. I'm asking them just to inform the churches that they have a history of repeatedly molesting children. And so parents beware. There's a difference between that and wagging your finger at people and, and shaming them and spitting at them and that sort of thing.
And Jimmy, I've said it to you before, and I've mentioned it in a podcast before. Truly, if a known pedophile / molester of children who has served his time in prison, and we won't go through the whole scenario again, to have done that, there had to be tons and tons of evidence, factual evidence against this person. But if they truly were on their full guard against spending time with children or being tempted with children, they themselves would go to the congregation and say, hey, this is who I am. I'm here to worship God. I'm not here in any other capacity, but I want you to know who I am.
Well, and I think even beyond that, here's a phrase that you would hear from a repentant person, regardless of what their sin is. Never mind even abuse.
That, yeah.
Regardless of what their sin is, here's a phrase that you'll hear from a repentant sinner. And this is really, really important, and it's simple. I have no secrets. Mm-hmm. I have no secrets. Mm-hmm. I have nothing to hide. There's nothing about my life that is hidden. Mm-hmm. I'm going to be transparent. There's no part of my life, as much shame as that brings on me to talk about it, there's no part of my life that I'm going to keep secret or hidden from anybody any longer.
Mm-hmm. It's the same type of trust that we should have within a marriage. That builds. If we're married to the church, if we're, part of the church, we're a family of the church, we want that transparency with one another. We don't try to guard against it. We don't try to put a curtain up, a veil up, so you can't see part of someone's life.
Yeah.
The
opposite, the opposite of that is very alarming when somebody says it's none of your business.
Right.
Or I'm too ashamed to talk about it.
No.
Those are major red flags.
Right.
That means that somebody's not being honest with you whatsoever.
Right. And, again, liken it to the relationship, the truth relationship that we should have within the marriage bond.
Yeah.
You don't hold secrets with each other.
Or get irritated or agitated if somebody asks about, if your spouse asks you about a certain part of your life.
Right.
Getting agitated with them just demonstrates that you're not being honest and that you have something to hide.
There's a problem with that area.
Sure, absolutely. Right. So, number 3, I think churches are going to be forced to reconsider prevention training. I think this is really important, and I think that more people from within the church, more lay members, need to really be having discussions and open communication with their church leaders and say, we really need to talk about and do something proactive on the preventative side of abuse. Right. If they're not taking that seriously, if they're not taking prevention seriously and even having a conversation about that, I think it's up to the parents who have children in the church to take that charge.
Absolutely. And just name briefly, Jimmy, real quickly, 2 or 3 things that churches would do as part of a prevention policy or prevention.
Yeah, I think on the bare minimum side of requirements, you do criminal background checks. Now that, they're not effective, so it's kind of a double-edged sword. But it does limit liability. And if you do have somebody who's a sex offender, who's a closet sex offender within your church, and they've never told anybody that, which happens fairly often, you're going to catch those people.
Absolutely.
And you'll be able to turn them out. So, background checks are essential. In Pennsylvania, it's actually mandated. We have to, by law, at our church, have background checks on anybody who volunteers with kids in any capacity.
And I think that is so important.
Oh, I think it's great legislation. Yeah, I think it's really good.
Within the school system, where I served on the school board for 15 years, that was essential for any volunteer with sports or anything. If you came into the school to volunteer as a parent, for reading once a week or whatever it was, same thing. Well,
I think I'll mention a second one, and I think this is really important. That's to have a written policy, and you have to have, this is not optional, you have to have a written policy that's fairly exhaustive but not exhausting. You don't want something that nobody's ever going to read or pick up, but you want it to spell out the boundaries, the physical boundaries, the emotional boundaries. Those need to be spelled out, along with the consequences for violating those boundaries. Okay. So, people ask me sometimes about what if somebody in your church likes to hug people a lot? Well, that shouldn't be considered automatically a quote unquote red flag behavior, because some people just like to hug people. Some people are touchy-feely.
Jimmy, can I hug you?
No.
I just thought I'd throw that in.
Some people are touchy-feely, and they just hug too much. In fact, my wife, this is pretty funny. I have to say this. Last night we were watching The Voice, and she said, I could never be a contestant on The Voice because they hug too much.
Okay, and that
some people don't like hugs.
My head, yes, because
my wife is one of them. She does not like hugs, even from me. And that doesn't mean that she's not compassionate and not affectionate. She just doesn't like. She's not a touchy-feely person.
And I'm just the opposite. I have to refrain myself.
Yeah, some people are,
because anymore I have to stop and think. Wait a minute, this person might not want to be hugged. My initial thought is, when I meet somebody, I want to grab them and hug them, and and I have to reserve myself.
Well, what a lot of people don't realize is that, that could be a very triggering thing for anybody who's been sexually abused. You could have children who are currently being sexually abused, and they may resist your hug.
Yeah.
And if a parent's standing there who doesn't know that child's being sexually abused, and they're like, oh, what's the matter with you?
Yeah.
You need to, when somebody comes in and they hug you, let them hug you. So we actually have spelled out in our written policy at our church that no adult's allowed to initiate any physical contact with any minor. So what that means is we can't pull kids into us. We can't go up and initiate a touch with a kid or a hug or, things like that. Yeah. If a kid wants to come up and hug us, that's fine, within boundaries.
Right.
We also have those boundaries spelled out. But the adults can't initiate that physical contact with minors. So that's really important. Number 4, the next thing that we think is going to happen is there's going to be a shift from professionally trained ministers and pastors to survivors who train to become ministers. I think that there are going to be a lot of churches springing up that they're going to be leading the way to show how to care for the wounded. So I'm already seeing this in the advocacy realm. There are a lot of abuse survivors who are advocates who are going into ministry. And I don't want to say it's because they're fed up with the church. They might be frustrated with the church, but that's not their motivation for doing it. Their motivation for doing it is because they've experienced abuse of the worst kind, and they just want to minister to the wounds of other people. Right. I'm really encouraged by that. I think that's incredible.
Become compassionate hearts to others. And the Bible, that's a very scriptural thing, that, the wounded will help the wounded because you understand. Yeah. So it's a wonderful thing.
2 Corinthians chapter 1 is all about comfort. Paul uses the word comfort in the most concentrated, rapid succession that's found anywhere in all of the Bible. And he uses the word comfort in 2 Corinthians 1 over and over and over and over again. And he says, when I'm comforted, or when we're comforted, it's for your comfort. When we suffer, it's also for your comfort. So where we're comforted, we comfort you. Where we suffer, that happens for your comfort. And then he goes on and he's telling other people that they need to comfort people. When you've been comforted, you need to comfort other people. When you've been wounded, you need to comfort other people. So it's a really encouraging chapter, and I encourage all of our listeners to go and read 2 Corinthians chapter 1. It's a beautiful, beautiful passage.
I'm going to interject here why I love this so much that's happening. When I was a kid growing up within the Church of Christ, sermons were far different from what we would hear now, and I know in the future they're going to be even more far different from what I heard. As a child, I heard horrible things constantly, week after week, about being thrown into the pit of burning fire. It was all this fire and brimstone preaching, pounding down of the fist, shouting out. I was petrified as a child, and I can remember going to bed many, many, many nights after church with having nightmares, being so afraid I was going to be thrown into hell. I know this is really, really dumb, but I'm going to share it anyway. One night I was having a screaming nightmare, and my mother came in to ask me what was the matter, and I couldn't catch my breath. And finally she said, "Look, you're going to have to tell me what happened." I said I picked my nose. And honestly, I was afraid, because I was told you never pick your nose in public, that I did that I was afraid I would go to that place of burning fire because of that.
Well,
that's how bad it was.
So imagine for all the abuse survivors who were being raped in in the privacy of their homes or in the corners of their churches, who are being told all these things, that if you do things that are far more minor than that, you're going to hell.
I have thought about that so many times, Jimmy, about the trauma, the additional trauma that has happened.
So I think the final one for things that are going to happen is that the spiritual outcasts are going to be gathered up and they're going to be united. So the people who don't have a church to call home, they still believe in God, but they've been injured by the church. I think that they're going to be gathered up. And I'll put a plug in for Porch Swing Ministries. In fact, I'm going to have Christine Parker on a podcast as a guest so that she can talk about Porch Swing Ministries.
That'll be absolutely wonderful.
We just had a meeting today, our first official board meeting at Porch Swing Ministries. I sit on the board of directors, and that's what that ministry is about. And I think we're going to see a lot more of those types of ministries crop up. So what are the things that need to happen? Number one, leaders are going to be humbled. I think there's been a dangerous movement that places church growth above spiritual nurturing and maturity. Leadership has to be humbled. They have to be brought to their knees.
And what do you mean by that, Jimmy? That leadership has to be brought to their knees?
God talks a lot about a contrite heart. There has to be a rending of the heart whenever horrible things have happened to innocent people. God tells us that your heart, you need to rend your hearts, and you need to put on sackcloth and ashes. You need to lament whenever people have been injured around you. It's not a time to celebrate. It's not always a time to celebrate.
Right.
We have this weird theology that says, as soon as you step over the threshold and come inside of this worship service, this is where we praise God and we jump up and down and we clap hands and we worship the Lord with all of our might.
You're not putting that down
not at
by
all.
any means.
Not at all.
We do want to praise and worship God in that way. However,
but they're also, and this ties into another point. We need to create safe spaces within our churches where shepherds protect the innocent on the one hand, and on the other hand, people are free to lament all that's been lost. We have to create these spaces where people are free to lament. So that's all I meant by leaders being humbled. I think there's no room for arrogance, for quote unquote teaching people without listening. I say quote unquote because a lot of times when we go into teacher mode, we begin to get arrogant. And Paul says that knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. And I think we need to remember that the end goal as leaders of a church is not to be knowledgeable and give other people that knowledge. The end goal is to love, and to love completely, and to love fully and truly. And love protects, love honors, love respects people. And so if we're not doing those things, we can have the cleanest, crispest, most presentable worship service and have people who are just injured and suffering. And I think we absolutely have to be humbled in order for there to be healing. And finally, we need to be praying congregations.
I'm so glad you added that, Jimmy, because I think prayer is foundational to love. Prayer is foundational to compassion. Prayer is foundational to understanding the pain and suffering of others. It is our connection to God. And
each other.
And each other.
And there's something, going back to being humbled, there's something humbling about literally getting on your knees and pouring over someone in prayer. And I'm not talking about like the quick power prayers that we do where, we find 2 minutes to squeeze in a real quick prayer. Mm-hmm. I'm talking about to rest our voices, to just stop, to pause, and to really get lost in that prayer and to think about the person who we're praying for. And, when I do that for my own kids or for my wife or for whoever it is within my family or within my church, when you really sit down and stop and feel what they're feeling and have that level of empathy, it breaks you and it humbles you.
Us. It truly does. Yes, absolutely.
And you begin to pour over that person in prayer rooted in love. And it's not just this generic prayer. Well, I pray that X, whatever it is. I pray that you get better, or I pray that you find healing, or I pray that you find peace. We have kind of these cliche prayers, and there's a difference between that and getting lost in that prayer. Right. And that's a very humbling thing.
It surely is. And it's powerful.
Very powerful.
Yes.
So we're going to leave you with the truth bomb for today. And our truth bomb for the day is to survivors. And we just want you to continue to unite and show the world how to love. We just have so much respect for you and teach people how to love. Well, thank you all for listening to this episode, and we'll catch you next round. Thanks again for listening to today's episode of the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast. If you found it helpful, please follow on Spreaker, subscribe on Google Play Music, Apple Podcasts, or Stitcher. Share with your friends and tell the world. Join us in speaking out on sex abuse so we can change the tides and prevent abuse.